Before we get started, I want to encourage you to subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications so that you don't miss any of the content that is released by GoCollect. And if you're interested, head over to Regie Collects here on YouTube. Regie here, your friendly neighborhood bodybuilder and comic book collector and the host of the GoCollect speculation video, and I want to welcome you to another episode. Let me tell you how good this week's blog posts are. There is some amazing content that is contained in the 5 blog posts that we are going to be looking at. We have 2 founders having a conversation about CBCS. We have someone breaking down the differences between a comic book collector and an investor. We have someone that is looking at affordable Silver Age books. We have yet another blogger that is examining an old blog post that was incredibly well written and analyzing whether what was presented in that blog post still holds true 6 months later. There is something for everyone in this one. Stay tuned. This first blog post is actually a transcript from a YouTube conversation between 2 founders, specifically Jeff, the founder of GoCollect, and Steve BOROCK, the founder of CBCS. And over the course of this conversation, there are some amazing details that are actually revealed about what it is that CBCS is working on. And I'll be honest, I am a little jealous. Jealous that I didn't have an opportunity to do this interview because there is some great news that is actually broken. One of the first things that the 2 founders spoke about was the turnaround time. And I think it's pretty commonly known that collectible grading services are being hammered right now. Many of them have some awful turnaround times just because there has been an amazing influx of books into these grading companies. And we're not just talking about comics, we're talking about many types of collectibles. But in this interview, Steve actually reveals that CBCS is doing pretty well with its turnaround time. And I actually want to read his comment around this because I think that it's important. He says, everyone is putting in extra time. We're at 12 weeks for the lowest tier, specifically the lowest grading tiers for comics, but the regular tiers are 2 days, 1 day, and rapid is 5 days, and so on. So he is basically saying that they are doing pretty well with their turnaround time, which is impressive because not everyone can actually make that claim. One of the next things that they actually spoke about was the fact that CBCS is working on something secret. They are specifically working on a magazine size holder. And this has been something that a lot of collectors have been asking for, a magazine size slab that they can actually get to protect their books. And CBCS basically reveals that they are working on a prototype of this right now, and if all goes according to plan, they may actually have something that people can look at and order by the summer. One of the other things that the 2 founders spoke about that I feel is a true differentiator for CBCS is their ability to verify signatures that are placed on comics. And CBCS's nearest competitor actually requires that signatures be witnessed in order to count. With CBCS, they actually have the ability to verify signatures. And the truth is that a lot of people have comics that were signed long before grading companies even existed. So in my mind, again, this is a true differentiator. And Steve BOROCK in this interview actually reveals that they have hundreds of signatures from creators on hand that actually allow them to verify signatures. And again, in my mind, this is a major differentiator for them as an organization. They also touched on another thing that sets CBCS apart, and it is the idea of people being able to obtain free grader's notes. And Steve kind of explains how the grader's notes come about. And he provided us, at least in my mind, with some great insight into how it is that CBCS actually grades books. There is a person that initially does a grade of a comic, captures notes, counts the pages, passes that book and those notes off to another grader who then refines the notes and evaluates the grade that has been assigned. And then there is a finalizer that actually looks at everything that has been done thus far and kind of signs off on it. And so these graders' notes basically get passed from grader to grader to grader before a final grade is assigned. And basically what they do is they take those notes and then give them to the person that, submitted the book to be graded. And they also capture those notes in a QR code. So people actually have the ability to scan the QR code that is on the label and to see those graders' notes without having to pay for them. Again, a differentiator for CBCS. And in my mind, it was really nice to actually have them tout some of what makes them different and unique, because I think that that's how they will potentially get ahead, is by focusing on the strengths that they actually have as an organization. In addition to these many things that they talk about that I've already mentioned, they go on to talk about a really great fundraiser called the Hero Initiative. And if you don't know about this, I definitely want to encourage you to spend some time reading this blog post to learn about the Hero Initiative, but also to check out the details around some of the things that I've already spoken about. This transcript is actually located and linked in the description, but you also have the ability to check out the video as well, which will also be linked down in the description. Check it out. So I definitely want to encourage you to take some time to read this next blog post, because not only is it well written, but I think that it is also insightful as well, specifically if you are relatively new to the hobby. And I say that because the blogger does a great job of kind of identifying two categories of people. One being the comic book collector, the other being the comic book investor. And there is a subcategory that is referenced here of a speculator. And what's great is that the blogger essentially defines these different categories of people and then explains why it's kind of important for you to figure out who you are and how you want to show up to the hobby, because it guides how you execute and how and why you purchase different books versus others. The blogger defines a comic book collector as someone who chooses to amass and preserve comic books as they see fit. And I always say a comic book collector is nothing more than a person that buys a comic and puts it in a box. And of course, there's levels of complexity that we can add to it, but fundamentally, it is a person that collects comics. That's essentially it. There is also a definition, as I mentioned, for a comic book investor, and this one is a little bit more involved. But a comic book investor is defined as someone who purchases a particular asset with the intention of selling that asset for a higher price at a later date, ultimately generating a profit for themselves. The blogger goes on to define a subcategory of a speculator as someone strictly purchasing the book to sell within 12 months or less. Now, what's really great, again, about this blog post is that we have some definitions that we can kind of wrap our minds around. And I don't know that I really thought about the nuanced differences between a speculator and an investor. So I kind of appreciate that. But the blogger also highlights here that these groups are not mutually exclusive, right? You can have someone who is a comic book collector who is also an investor. So there is a lot of overlap that exists between these categories of people. But this is a great blog post for people to read, to ask themselves some questions. What type of collector or investor or speculator are you? And then how does that guide what you do when it comes to this hobby? This blog post is linked down in the description. Give it a read. This next blog post is honestly a solid one. And I think that it's solid because not only does it provide us with some great information, but it contradicts a misperception that people have. There are a lot of folks out there that believe that the ship has sailed on the Silver Age, that there's no way that they can get Silver Age comics at affordable prices. And I honestly, fundamentally disagree with that. I think that there are still great buying opportunities out there. And our next blogger actually does some sleuthing to identify 5 Silver Age comics that are still affordable for the average collector. And I say average collector because that is what's referenced in the blog post, but I believe that these books represent buying opportunities for all types of collectors. And I'm not going to talk about all 5 books that are identified because I want to encourage you to check out the blog post yourself, but I am going to talk about a couple of the books. The first book is Incredible Hulk issue number 102, and this book picks up where Tales to Astonish 101 actually leaves off. And what's great about this is that this book is essentially the start of a decade-long Volume 1 run for the Incredible Hulk. And this book also is the retelling of Bruce Banner's origin story. So for those folks that may have been priced out of those first 6 issues of Incredible Hulk, the original first 6 before the book was actually canceled, Incredible Hulk issue number 102 is a great book to pick up because it retells that origin. But here's the thing, again, this book is still very much affordable. Recently sold prices for this book include a CGC 7.5 that sold for $385, a 5.5 that sold for $185, and a 3.5 that sold for $127. Again, these are not bad prices for an awesome book where we get the retelling of an origin story. The next book that the blogger talks about is Doctor Strange issue number 169, and this book represents the first solo title featuring Doctor Strange. Not a first appearance, but the first solo story. And everybody knows that Doctor Strange is going to play a very important role in the MCU moving forward. And this is not a bad book to pick up. I literally have this book hanging on my wall right now. That's how much I believe in this book. Recent sales prices for this book include a 7.5 that sold for $610. Now this one is interesting because the price before that was only $384, so that's a big jump. A 5.5 sold recently for $301, and a 3.5 sold for only $147. So again, first solo story of a classic Silver Age character that you can get for just a couple of bucks. I recently had a chance to check out the trailer for Shang-Chi. And if you haven't seen this trailer, you have to check it out because it is honestly amazing. But with that movie pending on the horizon, this next book is one that I wanted to highlight because it is the first appearance of the Mandarin, who is supposed to appear in the Shang-Chi movie. And I am specifically talking about Tales of Suspense issue number 50. And again, this is the first appearance of the Mandarin, so it is a cool book to pick up. Recently sold prices include a 7.5 that went for $1,275. And this book definitely is an outlier. It is a book that we want to keep an eye on, because when you look at a 5.5, for example, that book is selling for $440, and a 3.5 is selling for $350. And our blogger goes on to say that he believes that this character is one that we may see for a long time to come. We may see him in several different movies moving forward, so this potentially is an undervalued blue ocean opportunity. There are 2 other books that are mentioned in this blog post that I am not going to talk about. I want to encourage you to check this blog post out, read it in its entirety, and decide for yourself if this is something that you want to act upon. This next blog post is one that I enjoyed reading, and I think that you'll enjoy it as well. And I have a feeling that potentially the blogger had a smile on their face as they were working on this blog post. And I say that because this thing is really well written, but there's also some analogies in here to football. And I rather enjoyed the fact that it wasn't just, here is the book, here's some data about the book. It seemed like the blogger was having some fun with this one. But this blog post is essentially a 6-month review of a blog post that was written originally by Matt Tuck. And our blogger is asking the question as to whether Matt Tuck's analysis and assessment that was done 6 months ago has stood the test of time. And in the original blog post, Matt Tuck actually wrote about 3 books that have some significance and are tied to the upcoming Green Lantern series set to be released on HBO Max. And those books were Green Lantern 59, the first appearance of Guy Gardner, Justice League 31, the first appearance of Jessica Cruz, and Green Lantern 201, the first appearance of Kilowog. And all 3 of these books have some significance. All 3, again, are tied to the HBO Max series that is going to come out at some point. But our blogger basically asked the question as to whether the guidance provided by Matt 6 months ago was solid advice. And I don't want to give it away, but I will tell you, in 2 out of 3 cases, the guidance that was provided stood the test of time. 2 out of the 3 books are continuing to perform incredibly well. The third, not so much. I want to encourage you again to check this blog post out. If you are a Green Lantern fan, if you like to speculate, this is a blog post that you want to read. It is linked down in the description. Are 90s image books making a comeback? That is the question that our next blogger is attempting to ask and answer. And the blogger is asking this question because when you look at Spawn number 1, which is a book that has been printed heavily, this book has actually increased in value by 100% over the last 3 years. And the question is, are other image books from the 90s potentially going to see a bump in value? And the blogger actually points out here that 90s books in many ways get a bad rap. But as a collector from the 90s, some of that bad rap is actually justified. But there are also some amazing books that came out of the 90s that I think are still awesome books. One of the books that the blogger talks about that may be potentially poised for a rebound is Wetworks issue number 1. And at present, there are only 100 graded copies of Wetworks issue number 1 on the CGC census. And on April 4th, a CGC 9.8 copy of this book sold for $120, which is crazy, considering that you might actually be able to find this book in a dollar bin and could send it in to CGC and get a 9.8. Your return would be incredible even after you subtract out your fees for grading and cleaning and pressing and all that. So Wetworks is interesting. This was not one of my favorite reads from back in the day. I read it, but not one of my favorites, unlike the next one from Jim Lee. And we are specifically talking about Wildcats issue number 1. I absolutely love this book. I absolutely love Jim Lee. Unfortunately, I do not have 9.8s of this book, but I do have some really awesome copies. And over the last 3 years, across 136 sales, the value of a CGC 9.8 for this book has increased by about 18%, which is not bad considering the fact that you can actually find high-grade raw copies of this book for as little as $7 on eBay. And again, like the first book, this might be one that you want to take shot on goal at and maybe pick up a raw copy, send it into CGC, and again, your return would not be terrible at all. The very last book that the blogger talks about is Young Blood issue number 1. And I have to tell you, I did enjoy this book back in the day. Rob Liefeld gets a bad rap from a lot of people, but I enjoyed Young Blood back in the day. Now, the big ding against this book is that, unlike some of the others, this book is not the first appearance of the Young Blood team. They actually appear elsewhere, and that is part of the reason why maybe this book is not one of those that is poised for a rebound down the line. If you are a fan of 90s books or Jim Lee or Image or any of that other kind of stuff, I definitely want to encourage you to check this blog post out. It is linked down in the description, and let us know what you think about this one. Is it possible for Image comics from the 90s to have a rebound and to increase in value despite the fact that they were heavily printed back in the day? Let us know what you think. So there we have it. We have reached the end of another recap video. I hope that you enjoyed this episode. And if you did, I certainly want to encourage you to hit the thumbs up button and leave a comment behind. And if you're feeling frisky, come back next week when we get to do this all over again.